Hi, for those of you I don't know yet, it's a pleasure to meet you. For those who I've seen before, it's a pleasure to see you again. And thanks for letting me kind of come in and chime in on a few things that we know about. Um, for those of you who don't know me, I'm an archaeologist by training, an historic preservation by love, an anthropologist by just clear act of, I don't know, momentum, and tentatively been in this neighborhood of the Middle Peninsula and the Northern Neck for a long time now. I'm about as average a white guy as you could possibly find, except I have a PhD, but I mean, what does that really get you? I got to read a lot of books and write a long paper. That was fun. And at the same time, I have been really blessed to go and work on these really amazing projects that often deal with descendant communities. One of the ones I'm most proud of is working at the Werowilkomoko site, which is, everybody knows is the place more openly is where Pocahontas saved John Smith in theory. But also it's a place of great significance for the indigenous people in Virginia, particularly those whose cultures trace back to east of I-95. And for me, it was an opportunity to go ahead and to work with descendant communities in a large-scale basis for the first time, and something that I've learned a lot from, I hope. I continue to learn a lot from as I work with the Park Service and the tribes on projects as they continue. And also, I've been lucky enough to work with a variety of different groups at different locales across the Middle Peninsula on projects that are particular to them that I'd like to say I bring my expertise to, and I try to listen. I try to share what I know and talk less, but also provide information so that others can make decisions for themselves. As a principal, the not-for-profit that I co-direct with Thane Harpole, we try not to tell people what to do. We try to make sure that they have as much information as possible. They have maybe some case studies and some examples of failures and successes that we've had so that they can make their own decisions. But those decisions will be very well informed. And they'll have some of the experience that we have behind them so that they can then proceed as they see fit. Part of that is just my general introduction to things, my acknowledgement that, I'm going to try to do my best in explaining these things that I know. And then I'm really excited about learning new stuff, even in brief encounters like this, and hopefully longer term as I get to know all of you. I do teach historic preservation and the history of museums at the College of William and Mary as an adjunct, and love any moment I can to try to get in the van and get up to the Northern Neck and the Middle Peninsula, albeit it's tough when you're on the Lower Peninsula. It's a little bit of a distance even for my 3-hour classes I teach. So looking forward to trying to continue to build those bonds. Alice, is it possible for you to, it may already be set up, but oh yeah, I can share my screen.
Yeah.
Yay! Okay, I'm gonna try to turn on my PowerPoint and we can get down to business. Okay, let me see if I can do this. Okay, I want to share.
David, why are you doing that? Are you part of the Swin Library?
I'm sorry, say again, sir?
I said, are you part of the Swin Library?
I use it quite a bit. I know some remarkable librarians and archivists there, but I'm not officially affiliated with them, no.
Okay.
No, I work with them a lot because we do a lot of preservation work at the Fairfield Foundation. That's, I call it preservation with the lowercase p. The point being is that we are trying to do preservation of all sorts, and often that leads me to connecting people. So we do an archive or a collections assessment. We usually try to get people in touch with folks who know more than we do. So Jay Guidemore at SWEM in their archives is fantastic. We try to get him set up on outreach endeavors to other communities where he talks about the collections that they have, but also proper curation and care. Same goes for folks doing research and trying to do a deep dive into these things.
Okay.
All right, so I didn't practice this, but I've got it basically down for about 15 minutes. If there's something of a serious note, you just raise your hand, yell at me, tell me to stop, and say, I have a question. I can flow with that as we go along. So the African and African-American archaeology of Menokin has been encapsulated within the broader idea of historic preservation and landscape cultural analysis since the inception of archaeology at Menokin. The historic preservation side of things has been led by folks saying, we need to test to see if something is in a certain location because we're going to destroy it. That comes along with things like putting in a picnic shelter, building a visitor center, or the necessary work when you're doing construction around a building that you're trying to preserve. If you want to go ahead and modify that landscape, the ground disturbance, particularly at a place like Menokin, is extremely destructive because the integrity of the site is so exceptional. There are layers of really important information archaeologically that exist within inches of the ground surface. In other areas of the site, there's a much greater buffer between the area that we walk that we can see easily and the actual intact archaeological remains beneath the ground surface. So I'll go a little bit into that as we go along. But starting off, I want to talk about how what you're going to see in this is partially the idea that folks were looking in spots because they were interested in preserving those, because the ground disturbance was coming. The flip side was research. And so they either looked at everything, hoping to find whatever they could at this very superficial level, or they were trying to look at a specific area more in depth because they had a specific question that they wanted to ask. When I think of Menokin, I think of people. But when I'm thinking and trying to describe the kind of reason that a lot of people go to visit, when they don't know the same people I know, I think of obviously this landscape, right around the house in particular. It's what a lot of us get caught up in, which is essentially looking at the manor house. And for a long time, people have always talked and illustrated these places as essentially white spaces. And that's not necessarily accurate. Not only were they completely populated by enslaved African and African Americans, but even later in the 19th century post-emancipation, there were many of these colonial plantation houses that were lived in by tenants, including the one I work at, Fairfield Plantation. When it became a farm after the Civil War, the primary occupants of the house were one time enslaved Africans. And so I start to look at these buildings first and foremost as structures constructed by Africans, African Americans, places where people, both the white property owners, their guests, as well as slaves, were living within throughout their existence. And then after emancipation, particularly with property ownership and other things changing, these were often still Black places and Black spaces. And so it's something that I try to keep in mind when I'm describing these to people. In our case, we don't talk about Lewis Burrell as having built Fairfield. We talk about Lewis Burrell as having been involved with the construction of the building. And then we try to talk about how his enslaved labor force undoubtedly constructed many of the bricks, put them together, worked with the masons that may have been skilled and brought over from England, but trying to tell a more complete story. And this image right here is impressive, and it really tells you about the kind of magnitude of architecture at Menokin. And it opens the door for looking into these spaces as being something more than just white spaces, more than just stories about Francis Lightfoot Lee and his family, or the Talos, or even all the way up to the Alejandros. This is a place that's really kind of complex and awesome. And so you see the primary house, you see the terracing falling off in the distance, but you also see the two dependencies. And the dependency on the right, or the bottom of the screen, is the kitchen. And so as we look at these places, and we're beginning to see more and more scholarship come out that properly recognizes these dependencies for what they were, we become very interested in understanding, okay, well, how do these places and spaces operate? Because we all acknowledge, or we're beginning to acknowledge, the powerful role of the African American and Africans on these plantations and their exceptional nature above and beyond just a labor force, but to the individual level. The architectural renderings can be in the same guise. It can be an introduction, it can be a hook. For a lot of public interpretation, I think it's what provides people a sense of understanding initially, and then it provides also a jumping off point for discussing something more. Often in the cases of fine buildings like Menokin, you're talking about craftsmanship, you're talking about the labor that it takes in order to construct these places. And so that's always an invitation to talk about the other communities of different people in different areas on the plantation. And not just looking at a place like this. This is a rendering of a quarter in the Piedmont, actually, that was just really evocative, showing kind of the space and also the complex landscape that's associated with slave quarters of that period. And this is of your late 18th through mid 19th century kind of arrangement. And at Menokin, you have such a tremendous amount of acreage that extends far beyond the manor house that it's become somewhat accepted that there certainly would be several slave quarters within this proximity, and then also tenant farmer houses that were likely, lived in by African Americans throughout into the mid 20th century. Some of them have been known for a long time. So as you're walking down the trail to Cat Point Creek, you can see the chimney. It's a residence for African Americans. But also there are scatters of artifacts in the field that triggered involvement early on by archaeologists and students from the University of Mary Washington. And just very quickly, skipping ahead to this slide, you can see the number of different archaeological sites that are connected with artifact scatters. These are primarily just groups of artifacts that were found in the field, but they represent, as these little squares, they're actually far larger than that, but they vary in size. So some of them might be 50 or 100 feet in diameter, meaning the concentration as you walked around the field would measure about that size. Others are actually far larger. We're talking 600 to 900 feet in diameter, maybe even larger than that, because they likely were created through the building and later destruction of several buildings in close proximity. So in particular, the area directly north of the manor house, as along the tree line in specific, there's undoubtedly several buildings, albeit in this map, it's represented by a single orange square that you see here. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through with the description. I'm gonna go one slide back. And just, I hate it when people read slides to me, but I'm gonna do it anyways, and my apologies in advance. Where are spaces created, lived in, modified by Africans, African Americans? I go through the labor of talking about both Africans and African Americans because I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there are both on this plantation, meaning that folks who are coming straight over from Africa, but also folks who were essentially brought from other places onto this plantation from families that had become established here in the colony, as well as those who were the second, third, and fourth generations of enslaved Africans who were here. Identifying these spaces can be remarkably difficult, but also there's such ambiguity that it works within a process of essentially asking questions. Having an hypothesis and testing that hypothesis can be a powerful process and still bring attention to the stories of these individuals. And this isn't particularly difficult because you do have white tenant farmers, although they're significantly less than the enslaved African population at that time, particularly with plantations like this. And you also have overseers that could both be enslaved African as well as white, depending on the period. It gives you a sense of what is the more likely scenario in that case. Second research question I've often brought up in these instances, what are the material remains, the artifacts, the architecture that speak to the lives of the enslaved and later tenant farmers at Menokin? And how can you tell what makes an artifact specifically link to a culture, a race, a group of people? That's one of the more difficult questions archaeologists have had over the last, I'd say, half century. As people became more and more interested in learning about the lives of the enslaved, lives of the African diaspora, they were asking, well, what are the key artifacts that you need to find in order to know that it's definitely them that you're talking about? And there are some that people have accepted as largely representative of that. But for us, it's always a scientific process of trying to pull together multiple lines of evidence and ultimately coming to a conclusion that you can then make sure could be reinterpreted later if additional evidence came to bear. So having that humility of understanding that you're not perfect going in has been a kind of a calling card for my generation of archaeologists as we're trying to say something worthwhile, trying to contribute, while at the same time not pretending that we know more than we know. And lastly, landscape chronology. All of these places change over time. And even the one area at Menokin that has received the most attention regarding the enslaved labor force certainly changed at least once during its lifetime. And it's reasonable to interpret that from the evidence that persists. So are all of these orange squares the sites of the enslaved or the sites of later African-American tenant farmers? No, but I think many of them are. And they've been interpreted as such on the state's inventory of sites, but they've also gone ahead and connected with certain pieces of evidence that talk about them potentially being more agricultural in nature, or possibly with sites like the one over here in the bottom left, sites that are related more likely to indigenous peoples and their occupation of the property. Now, this is to show what we have compiled, all of the archaeology that has taken place to date that is extended beyond the manor house. And so the red dots represent an individual hole that was been excavated into the soil. When we recover that soil, we sift through and recover those artifacts. We know where they're located down to the specific location. And you can see that it's been done in a grid pattern in at least 3 different locations. We've left off the ones that go along with the road that goes down to the Cat Point Creek, but there's been additional work that's been done there. And what this does is it gives us a sense of where we've looked so that when we make conclusions, we're not basing an absence of investigation and making a claim that nothing is there. When we focused predominantly around the house, what we were commonly finding are things like the ceramics you see in the upper right-hand corner. The process is fairly straightforward. It takes about 15 to 20 minutes to excavate each of these holes in the ground. They're in some cases 25 feet apart, in most cases 50 feet apart. And they're done systematically so that we can look at the artifacts and see how they concentrate. The artifacts as they concentrate together give us a sense of more intense occupations. The artifacts that are found further afield, without as many, tell us that something has either been more lightly occupied, possibly something that was dropped randomly. It's an area where we don't necessarily say the bigger, thicker concentrations are more important. Oftentimes archaeologists will do that because stuff, the things that we find, often drives the research that we do. But sometimes a few artifacts can be just as meaningful as 1,000 artifacts. And that's where we're looking at short-term occupations by peoples with much less access to material culture, and essentially sites that are on the kind of margins of what you would expect for a formal plantation. What you see in front of you, this graphic where it says the ruins right at the center, what I like to kind of draw attention to is specifically this kind of concentration of ceramics that extends north of the house. From what we understand, there was an avenue that went directly north from the house up into the tree line that you see when you're on the site today. And then it would turn and go down the tree line towards the historic roads that still exist. In this route, you can see that there's a significant number of ceramic fragments. These did not just randomly appear. These are within probably 10 to 15 feet of where they were originally dropped. And so this is reminiscent of the everyday lives of people and the trash that they would throw away, which we know is largely dispersed in the proximity to where they were living or doing whatever task was assigned at that time. And so this makes perfect sense to me to suggest that there are likely quarters and potentially functional buildings that exist on either side of this avenue as you progress north from the manor house and leave the property. Or conversely, for those to see who are entering the property along this formal avenue by land and coming up to the house. So it's of greatest significance to us is to kind of read that sign and understand, that there was a much different landscape today than there was in the past, and that past landscape included many, many additional buildings, of which these are the remnants. When we build these arguments together, we look at various forms of material culture that would give us some indication as to what was going on. You can see on the left, this is a chop tank sandstone. We include this because most of the building is built out of this material, and you might expect to have quarters and other buildings that are built of similar material as you get further and further away from the house. At the moment, it does not look like that is part of the plan. There are concentrations further down in the valley, but they may actually be natural. On the right-hand side, we switch and we say, well, what about brick buildings? Obviously, there's a lot of brick concentrated not too far away from the manor house, a lot of it being in the front yard, in between the two dependencies and to the north of the house. You also see it on the side, and it's suggestive of there being some potential other brick elements there. More difficult to see would be the slight concentrations of brick that are further out in the fields. And that tells us again that it's likely these buildings that correlate to those ceramics I showed in the earlier slide are likely not to include a tremendous amount of brick, but probably something more along the lines of a brick chimney, maybe a brick foundation, but largely frame houses that we see that would have lined the road on the way in. And that's actually kind of backed up by the evidence that you see here. On the left are nails. And you can notice that even doing a hole every 50 feet or every 25 feet is still lucky enough to find at least one nail, if not more. And what's surprising is that this is representative of what's going on in those areas. So we're only getting one out of dozens and dozens of nails that would have been associated in these relatively small areas. When you build them all together, you can say, oh, okay, well, now it makes a little bit more sense. We've got some buildings, and those buildings are largely reminiscent of the kind of structures that you would have had that are related to the enslaved Africans. Lastly, window glass. And as far as graphs and stuff, I think this is the last one I have for you guys. Window glass is, I always bring into these conversations because early on with archaeology, folks had essentially taken the idea that windows and slave quarters were just not two things that fit, unless they were like in immediate proximity to the manor house. The window glass that you see here is in concentration enough in these distant areas to suggest that, in fact, the slave quarters likely had glass windows, maybe not as many, maybe not as large, but they certainly had them as you went down this avenue. And while it makes sense that they're concentrated around the manor house, the glass in the fields is not getting there by chance. It's not just drifting out there as the plow turns the soil. These are essentially giving us an indication of what some of the quarters that were there were looking like. So again, this is the area that we've tested so far. The other small orange blocks that you saw before, those are largely from concentrations that are partially overlapping with these, but then also to a degree just found during surface collection after a heavy rain in the plowed fields. And so they're deserving of intense inspection like what you see with these shovel tests, these red dots. We would learn more about the specific locations of concentrations, but also their size. And I think that's what's kind of frustrating about the earlier sites, is that they're largely just kind of treated as specific dots. But I think the more you would examine the distribution of artifacts in those areas, you might find that there was essentially these varying site sizes that might reflect individual quarters versus multiple quarters in one locale, or even potentially longer periods of occupation, ones that start in the mid-18th century and that maybe extend all the way into the mid-19th century, maybe even as potential tenant farmer sites in the post-emancipation period. The one that you guys have likely seen some of is the quarter that was excavated prior to the construction of the visitor center. Right now, it's just placed here so that you can kind of see the schematic of how those quarters were arranged on the landscape. Just a couple of quick pieces of visuals to kind of remind us about, okay, what period are we talking about? This is likely late 18th, but mostly a 19th century area with two different occupations, but those included things like subfloor pits. Subfloor pits, also known as root cellars, are great for cold storage as well as kind of personal items. Sometimes they were clearly known by the property owners. In other instances, they were completely unknown to the property owners. We have documented examples of both on plantations across Eastern Virginia. What we know most is that they largely have artifacts that date to the last days of the quarter, or at least the filling of the holes. Occasionally, you will get what's called a living surface, which is at the very bottom of those, usually a more organic layer. Within that living surface is where you find artifacts from the daily use of the quarter throughout its lifetime. And so that's the kind of stuff that would have been put in, taken out, put in, taken out over long periods. Not just the end, but really the life of that subfloor pit. And a lot of these places will end up having multiple subfloor pits, sometimes from different periods, sometimes from one period. And archaeologists have been looking at demographics and how those change over time, knowing that early on in the late 17th, early to mid 18th century, you have multiple subfloor pits because they correlate to different groups that all exist within the same house. And then later on, as these houses become more of residences for complete family units, that's when you'll end up seeing specific, larger, but fewer number of subfloor pits as they seem to correlate to family groups over particular periods. So what you see here in the upper left-hand corner is an archaeological site plan. For scale, you can see the trench that goes down, or the ditch that goes down the middle of the site is essentially flanked by 4 archaeologists on the right. On the left is a difficult to interpret portion of that trench that was very shallow, and when they did the excavation, they recovered a bottle and tried to go ahead and to keep the remainder of these features intact and below the plow zone. That's a key point to remember with this excavation, is that very little digging actually took place. The initial instance in which this was discovered did remove a lot of the information that would have been very helpful in understanding this place and how it changed over time. All of those artifacts in the first 12 inches were completely removed. But the artifacts that within each of these different soil stains beneath, some that correlate to posts in the ground where buildings were built, others correlating to that ditch in between that separated 2 different house lots, and still others to those subfloor pits or to areas where they were excavating clay in order to make daub for the chimney or in order to make bricks that they would fire nearby. Those areas all end up getting filled with trash of some kind, of some concentration later, and in some cases immediately, in some cases over time. Each one of them is essential to understanding how lifeways were at this time for those people. And as you can see in the schematic here, you've got 2 of these buildings that are interpreted as being in line with one another and add a 90-degree angle to the trench that's going through the center of the site. The third building, if you will, building labeled as A, is labeled as A because it's believed, I believe by the archaeologists at that time, to have been an earlier feature, an earlier element of the landscape, so that you can see one slave quarter, and then later you can see an arrangement in which they've created 2 slave quarters with a separator in between. That change over time, I believe, really helps us understand more about how the landscape changed, but also how people's lives changed. It's an opportunity to talk about complexity, to talk about how the different pressures from outside environment came in and influenced the people who lived in these places. How difficult was it for them to go ahead and to move, to go ahead and to rebuild? Did that coincide with something else that was happening on the plantation and with the workforce? Or was it something that was driven by external factors? These are all kind of really excellent questions to ask. I think I've got 3 slides left. So I always like to highlight this because the topography at Menokin is so dramatic. The rolling roads in particular, but also just the correlation between having Cat Point Creek nearby and its connection with the outside world. And then on the far right, having access by road to somewhat urban areas as for the Chesapeake, as well as other plantations that are nearby. Del Upton, who's a somewhat famous architectural historian, who studied the 18th and 19th centuries and its architecture, would often talk about these separate Black spaces that could really only be known by Black people. And they often weren't places that archaeologists could necessarily recover because they're the trails that are connecting plantations. They're the spaces in between. There's not a feature that was found or artifacts that were left along the side, but they were certainly important to describe and connect people. And so I think of them in the same vein with some of these areas correlating to labor. The rolling roads were places where slaves were pushing hogsheads down and potentially bringing items back up. And so as they occupy these places, it's an important way of bringing attention to their lives and the efforts that they put in, what it was like to be them. I've also mugged quite a few of these graphics from Menokin and the talented contractors and volunteers that they've worked with in the past, experts all across the board. Again, just bringing attention to things like that changing landscape where the environment itself, the absence of trees, the presence of trees has continued to be, in my opinion, one of the most amazing elements of their interpretive focus because it's such a difficult one to both maintain this kind of pristine landscape that many folks are yearning for when they visit, as well as a more accurate one that kind of communicates what life was like at that time. Maps and particularly historic maps, even of the 19th and 20th century, can be really reflective of remnants of the 18th and 19th centuries landscapes. Roads in particular have always been striking to me for this instance. And so we've oftentimes tried to go ahead and to integrate those roads into the technology that we have today to better address those questions of, how did this place change? And just imagining in the future, being able to see dramatic landscapes like this, where technology is really bringing a sense of understanding to the average visitor, but then populating it with buildings and other landscape elements that would really communicate the complexity, the true complexity of that landscape. I know Menokin's been working on this for years, but it's still a difficult thing for all of us running small museums to try to figure out, what's the most effective way of investing the limited funds that we have, and also answering the questions that we know our descendant communities and our visitors are interested in hearing, and frankly, what we're all personally interested in hearing as well. And that's about it. I'm been lucky to be involved with Menokin and doing archaeology there since around 2007. And to be able to understand that this place is constantly changing and really open to understanding things in different ways. The past has been full of this kind of roller coaster ride of understanding. And I think it's been a really great moment to be able to take a look back and pull all of this stuff together, but then also to kind of get excited to share it with people, some of which have known this for a while and others who it's brand new. And then from there, you embark on that kind of journey of learning. So thank you for listening. And I'm happy to talk about questions, whether specific, like, what do these artifacts mean, all the way through to the general, whatever I can do to help.
Yes, I have a question. This is Frank Johnson, and thank you, Dr. Brown, for your presentation. I appreciate you for doing that.
Sure thing.
Yeah, sure. I'm just curious, from your perspective or experience or opinion or what have you, I'm just curious here. Why should Menokin do this? This being searching its enslaved community or descendant community. So why should Menokin do this? I'm just curious about your response.
All right, give me a second.
Sure.
It is not your average question, and it's a challenging and an awesome one. So, that's the kind of thing I get excited about, and I want to see if I hopefully don't fall completely flat on my face right out of the gate. Hmm.
Well, I'll tell you what led me to that question.
Okay.
When you first began the presentation, you mentioned about how a lot of the history on the plantations existed in like white spaces, so to speak. What's the colonial white history, et cetera. And you mentioned about a lot of the land would be, land disturbance, or to protect existing buildings, or to just focus in detail on a particular site. And it made me think that one reason would be, what about the humanitarian thing, the right thing to do, if you will. Although they were considered enslaved or slaves, but they're people, obviously.
Yeah.
So, that humanitarian aspect, it made me think of that as one why anyway, part of that question. So you made me think of that, and then it just made me think about, from your experience and what you see, and your opinion, why Menokin should do this. But you're welcome to need more time to think. No worries at all. But it's just something that came to mind.
I mean, it's a good question because there's a lot of. So my immediate reaction is I think they should do what the Descendant they should incorporate into their list of things they should be doing. The kind of results of engaging with a community that's not really been talked to, as it's really not been talked to, not been involved in the process, not been engaged. And I'm not talking about specifically you guys. I'm talking about most, let's say 95% of the not-for-profits that interpret historic houses, historic sites, and the stories that they present. So I think the right thing to do is kind of subjective and kind of relates to the moment in time that we're all experiencing. But sometimes it is the right thing to do. Or at least as a guy who suffers from a reasonable amount of white guilt, coupled with some knowledge that I gained through reading a whole heck of a lot of stuff and talking to people, but also listening. It's something that we haven't spent enough time as a discipline or as a community of museums, a community of interested historic preservationists, or even as anthropologists, if you think of the broader perspective. We haven't really spent enough time talking about what's easily 50% of the population across this region throughout most of its, the last 300 years. And for me as an historian, as an academic, I'm excited because it's a whole new area of stuff that we don't know. And maybe there's a chance that I'll be able to contribute something, and maybe I'll feel like I've made a difference in my life. That would be my kind of personal aspect to this. It's just like, I'm more learning as I go ahead and do these kind of things, that the meaning is less about whether or not I found something cool in the ground. It's about whether or not I actually make a difference in what I'm finding and how it affects other people. Ideally, affecting other people in a really positive way. So do they connect with the past? Do they see the world in a different light? I'd say one of the areas that I feel I've been able to contribute the most, or I hope to continue to contribute the most, is a sense that people feel like they've built empathy for other people today by doing this weird thing of doing archaeology. They somehow connect with people in the past by studying these questions. And they understand, like, okay, this was a difficult time in history. I'm now connecting with it because of the material culture connection, or because of the landscape connection. And now I can understand and I can see other people more as the humans that they are, and the difficulties and the struggles that they had, and the successes and the victories. And then now, I'm hopefully a better human being. And so I think the humanitarian reason of more stories equals better empathy, which is a great thing across the board, is one good way to do it. The key condition to all of that is going to be, are you pursuing this understanding that you need to do this in concert with others. Because I think there's a lot of white academics out there who'd be perfectly fine studying slave sites and have for years and interpreting the way that they see them being, but dispatching the involvement from the descendant communities or from, shoot, any African Americans with the idea that somehow there's too much of a disconnect between those groups and the past that they're studying for their opinions to be of value. And I've just never liked that take. I've always thought, you know, I'm going to learn more from the people who are working with me today. I'm going to incorporate those ideas. I'm going to build a team of which I can be the quietest of voices, of which I can be somebody who helps others succeed. And then this is a path, I think, where I can contribute and make a difference in other people's lives, while also making some mistakes along the way and hoping to have the humility to admit those as I go. Wow, this got really personal about me, and that was all my fault. So there you go. You're getting a little sample of me. I do see some folks have some chat questions, which means I talked for a while.
I think we just had Bo signing off because he had to go to another meeting. But
okay. All right. So other I swear my answers are not always 15 minutes.
This is Gloria. I have a question. Have you found any grave sites?
We have not. And it continues to be a point of great concern. There are no known cemeteries that I know of on the property. In the state of Virginia, it's a felony to disturb a known gravesite. Doesn't stop people from disturbing them, which is quite sad. But if there was the top 10 list of things that people would like to know about on the plantation, on the property writ large throughout its history, it would be grave sites, I think, easily in the top 5. Because I think that there are folks who know that there are other people buried on this property. And it's not just, you know, the indigenous people who likely settled and buried their dead here, but also probably mostly the enslaved Africans. And then I think some of the other folks who were some of the white owners and their families. I'm pretty sure that there's supposed to be graves that, like, we've lost track of where the other folks are buried. But Alice could probably tell you more about that, whether or not there's a hit list. Ooh, that's a horrible way of putting it. A checklist, yeah, that's better. For like who is buried where and who's missing.
Hey, Dave, question, piggyback on that one. So when you're doing test pits and they're every, you're talking about every 25 or 50 feet. And I know we have not done test pits in the entire property, nor, that would take a while. But what would be, would there be a sign doing those test pits of if you were at a location where there was a possible cemetery site for enslaved individuals? Would there be something, what would come up in that search for a test pit?
Shovel test pits, like what I showed before, are one of the worst ways of finding a cemetery.
Okay.
And it's because they're just not designed to find it. They're not designed to find features. And let me explain I'll use a grave as an example of what a feature is. So when you're digging a grave, you're going to dig a hole in the ground slightly larger than the coffin or the individual that you're burying. And when you do so, you're going to go through the dark topsoil at the top, and you're going to go through some very grayish material underneath it that's very thin. And then you're going to go into what we call the subsoil, which is clay, or a sandy clay in the case of Menokin. And so as you go down, you're going to take all that soil and you're going to put it next to you, and it's going to get all mixed up. So the dark plus the gray plus the orange is all going to get mixed. So when you place the human into the grave, you're going to take that soil and you're going to put it back on top, but you're not going to go specific to each layer. You're just going to take all the soil and push it back, and then Mother Nature is going to do its trick, and it's going to go ahead and bury it. Maybe there's going to be a bit of a depression as the human degrades, as the coffin degrades, if they're buried in a coffin. And so that essentially decay of that material, both the coffin and the person, ends up creating a void that's then causes a slump. It's why you go through cemeteries that are known, and you can sometimes see where people are buried based on the kind of ups and downs that you see as it
Yeah,
goes.
sunken ground, right, sunken ground.
So when we're doing a shovel test survey, we're digging into the ground a 1 foot diameter hole, about yay big, and we're going to go down until we get to that clay subsoil. And we're going to go into the clay subsoil a fair distance, maybe 10 centimeters. That's the general rule of thumb, to make sure that the clay is not redeposited, meaning it hasn't been churned up and then put back into the hole. But the way we do it gives you a very, very narrow perspective. And so it's not a super reliable way of being able to say, well, they did a survey over there and they didn't see any differences in the soil change, so it's definitely not a cemetery. I'd say more often than not, you've got good archaeologists. They're going to be able to see the changes in the soil and track them. And we found plenty of features in these shovel tests, but it's not a good rule of thumb for it. It's not a good way of finding it. So that's the initial problem with that. The better survey methods for finding cemeteries would be essentially a comprehensive search of historical documentation and a review of aerial photographs. And most organizations end up doing that at some point, because you're specifically looking for anomalies. You're looking for a group of trees in the middle of a field. You're looking for little clusters of things that are a little bit different, because they're usually fairly discrete locations. If you're not finding those, if you're not finding a little cross on the map that says that's where the grave is, if you're looked through all of your surveys and everything else associated with it, you can't see it. The next step is essentially to kind of look at the landscape as a whole. And the easier of the two to try to find, if you're looking at white property owners versus enslaved Africans, is the white property owners, because they're putting their grave sites in areas that logically fit within a Georgian mindset in the 18th century. And there's usually remnants of that in the 19th. Once you start burying in the late 18th century, you have established cemetery. And most family cemeteries just kind of build on that. There's an older premise that most plantation sites end up following that I don't know how reliable it is, that the slave cemetery is right outside of the white cemetery. That certainly does happen, but I don't know if it's something that's predictable or that's consistent. For this very simple fact that very few cemeteries for the enslaved persist in a kind of a marked and clearly known to a specific community, meaning oftentimes the white administrative community that is managing these sites. So another key element is reaching out to descendant communities. Now, those that have been smart enough to do that often are brought back to the problem that the previous generation knew exactly where they were, but none of us had thought to ask at the time, and now they've passed. When we first started at Fairfield, we started asking people, and not about the cemetery in particular, but just about issues writ large. And their initial response was, if you had started 5 years earlier, we would have had 3 people to talk to. So the human memory is something that often is left off.
That's frustrating.
Very. Yeah, I agree with you on that. There are techniques once you have particular areas of interest. And those techniques often deal with remote sensing. Remote sensing is, you've heard these terms before, ground penetrating radar, electromagnetometer, resistivity, conductivity, even using specific kinds of aerial photographs or aerial data, something called LiDAR, which does very, very specific measurements and can penetrate the roof canopy. LiDAR is probably the wisest investment, although it's extremely expensive even to this day to get the high quality data that you would need in order to go ahead and to identify the slumped in areas where graves were once put in the ground. It also relies on you having those in the forested areas surviving, because if you have them in an area that's been turned into an agricultural field, it levels things out. That first 12 inches is turned from being occasionally hilly to being essentially flat.
Flat, right.
So LiDAR is probably the next big frontier. As the price comes down, people will go ahead and start looking more into what kind of data is available. Most counties in Eastern Virginia have mid-grade LiDAR, which gives you a variable of about probably 6 inches to a foot, which is great for things. And actually, I think they've had it for this model in itself may have been constructed from LiDAR, but it doesn't help you with graves. Graves, you need the high grade, you need the good stuff. And they've done that at Montpelier as one particular place, and you can essentially see filled in ditches. You can see plow furrows, which are essentially the rough equivalent, albeit, distinguished enough that you wouldn't confuse the two. The other methods I've talked about before, ground penetrating radar, those are expensive because they require a lot of human labor and a specific skill set. If you want to hire somebody who does this for archaeology. And it takes a while because you're running a machine every 6 inches, a foot, maybe every 2 feet. If your only concern is finding graves, you know that your quantification is really a 6 foot by 2 foot anomaly that you're looking for, and you're looking for bunches of them. So you could conceivably do a 10 or 15 acre area, but it would probably cost you in the realm of $25,000 to $30,000 in order to do that. And so it helps that you kind of narrow it down to knowing exactly where you're looking. Now, the good news is that those techniques usually work pretty well in the coastal plain. So again, the areas east of 95. So if one day somebody came along and said, in this proximity is where the slave cemetery was at Menokin, a combination of methods would make that much easier to kind of narrow down, looking at things specifically for, whether it appears on aerial photographs, whether it appears in plats of that time, and was just something missed. You never know when something's going to be just like, oh, well, shoot, I thought this was something else. Like most historical documents, you read it through a different perspective, and it becomes a lot more impressive or a lot more important for the question that you're asking. All right, that was, I hope, a worthy long answer because I introduced a ton of information. So I hope I'm earning my keep at this point.
Well, you let me know that, which I didn't know was true, that that LiDAR can be used with a large tree canopy like we have, that it's successful through that. And I didn't think that was necessarily true. So that's really good information to have for me.
David, would like to, this is Judy Gordon.
Hey.
I want to thank you for such an informative presentation. And I would like to think this is the first of many contacts we'll be having with you in this group. But I'm wondering what you see as next steps in terms of archaeological investigation that would be helpful for us as a descendant community as we move forward.
All right, quick preamble to this answer. When I started doing archaeology, one of the first documents myself and Thane Harpole put together was an archaeological resource management plan for the Roswell Foundation. And it was their board of directors. And as an appendix, we included 14 options for them to choose from for their next step in archaeology. And they put that plan right up on the shelf where it belonged and never touched it again. Our goal was to explain to them all of the different options available to them so that they could choose. Mm-hmm. And that group, which was predominantly leaders of the community, I think they were exclusively white. There may have been somebody who was African-American on it, saw it very much through the lens of an architecture first, genealogy second, archaeology maybe. They wanted us to tell them what to do next, and we didn't. We said, here's a list, choose. And we offered to come back and give presentations on each one of them. And at the time I was a graduate student, so I wasn't charging them for anything because I was silly. But also because it was local, it was nearby, it was people I liked a whole lot. I don't want to put you guys in a similar situation if that's a mistake. But I still feel compassionately that is the proper way to go, is you compile a list of options and you explain these things, and then you engage with a community that ultimately is responsible from the kind of moral and ethical obligations of communicating it to the public, deciding for a community that has long been ignored or at least not been listened to, as well as fundraising and all of these other things that go along with it, because there's usually a plus minus to each. But that's like me trying to skirt around the answer of what I think would work well within this setting with certain assumptions. I'm happy to give that answer, but I worry about its validity. And as a professor at a college who goes ahead and assigns papers, I also see the cringe on my students' faces when I tell them, oh, just pick any topic you want. And they're like, no, tell me what to write my paper on. And I'm just like, okay, so these are sometimes just human conditions. Right now, one of the most popular and accessible elements for people to not only understand, but to build empathy through are kitchens. It's a bit of a trope, especially if you're looking to reach out in any way to kind of a white community that's kind of skeptical about learning about Black communities. Because it's a lot of the percentage of people who visit these sites these days. That hopefully will change as people find that there's real value to actually interpreting African-American stories with African-Americans about African-Americans. But I digress. Kitchens are places where food exists, but it's so much more than that. It is a complex network of negotiations. It is a heavily gendered space, which really elevates the stories of women. It also talks about families, because these places are often where children are raised. It talks about cuisine in a way that starts the conversation about not creolization in the way that we would talk about it in the 1990s and the 2000s, but really culture, conflict, and resolution, as well as the kind of introduction of things that became commonplace and then were appropriated. So there's stories of strength, stories of struggle, really amazing things that in some ways are dependent on the archaeology. But sometimes the archaeology is more about kind of giving color and contrast, giving a frame, as opposed to actually the story in and of itself. Individual artifacts can be really evocative and they can start that discussion. But a lot of the discussion about the kitchen is something that has been known and that is only really slowly evolving from its current story. So, it's something where you don't have to have all of the primary documents that correlate to the women who worked in that space across 100 years. You can start interpretation in the context of understanding the stories that are most important to the descendant community and how you want to convey them. And that often leads to then the questions that you ask of the archaeological material or questions that you ask of the architecture. And from there, you can say, well, this place is different, or this place is the same, or here's an individual story that we learned about because of this artifact, or this concentration of material, or this analysis of all of the food remains that were found nearby. And this does kind of correlate to the more stuff is more cool kind of idea, which I normally chafe at a little bit, but in the context of talking about enslaved Africans, I think it's worthy. I think it's a good thing, because in the past, people would talk about these assemblages and not really talk about them as products of Black labor or products of African diaspora kind of demonstrated across this multitude of European material culture, but also African material culture. So I wouldn't ignore the other sites on the property, but the kitchen is probably the place of the greatest bang for the buck. If you think of buck as being changing people's lives, and bang meaning these moments that are both memorable and accessible, without having to kind of bear down on the specifics of 6 visitors that you want to make the most difference with. My organization has long eschewed the idea that numbers are going to make the difference, mostly because we knew that we would never go ahead and have the same visitation as almost any other place. And at the same time, when you're dealing with a quality of experience, some of the stories that we're telling are very compelling, and they're going to go ahead and to attract a lot of interest. And so there isn't a shame in going ahead and telling compelling stories, as long as it's not the only stories that you're telling, because commonplace stuff is really the meat and potatoes and does a lot of the work.
Okay.
So kitchen is the easy answer. I think the other answers would be things like looking for the more distant quarters, looking for the spaces of transition, meaning how did things change from one period to the next? It could be from pre-emancipation to post-emancipation, and in this day and age today, a lot of us are looking at class as kind of a unifying factor for discussion. So looking at African Americans in the early 20th century is actually quite an important role for archaeology to play, because despite the fact that there's the exponentially larger number of documents referring to African American families in the early 20th century when compared to African American families in the early 18th century, that increase is still not sufficient enough to take on the full weight of interpreting their lives. What it does, I think, is it offers us something that we often don't have the chance to have elsewhere, which is connecting individual human faces and names, which again, part of the goal here is to kind of change lives by engaging with people. All right, I'm gonna stop talking. Sorry, I get excited about this stuff.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, I've got a question. Dr. Brown, in your, I guess, archaeology work and doing your research, talking about the slave cemeteries, would you say that the forest was a place where they buried a lot of the slaves? And is that part of your excavation to find slave cemeteries?
I'll try to answer this one quickly. Our excavations look to uncover all elements of cultural history, full stop. So we're interested in everything. Second, our survey is not particularly, that method of survey is not particularly good at finding cemeteries. But as we walk from one area to the next, testing as we go, we often will be observing the ground and looking for places when the conditions are appropriate to go ahead, and we will record landscape features. And cemeteries are certainly landscape features, specifically when they're in forests, because you have a chance of potentially seeing. I would say that the location of cemeteries in forests is most often a factor of the fact that we have been finding them there as opposed to in fields, because fields often will destroy most of the remnants of them, and it's just simply not something we've looked for. I'd be interested in figuring out, if I knew all the answers, how many cemeteries were put on flat land versus how many were done at the ends of knolls on peninsulas where the property owner decided not to go ahead and to cultivate that area, or the African American families were not putting things in those areas in the 19th and 20th centuries. So would I say that cemeteries are in the forest? Yes. Would I say that they are exclusively there? I don't know if we know enough to be able to say that. But it's certainly a place that I would look.
Well, does your work carry you into the forest?
It does. So the
Okay.
survey that I showed earlier, I'd say probably 40% of that survey was in the forest. And so when you're looking at the image that's on the screen, you can see my cursor. The forest line comes right in here and kind of comes around, because those terraces here, the first couple of ones are open. But the lower terraces the trees are starting to encroach on it. What we found fascinating is that the area of forest that's right here, still within the kind of topographic layout, is also incorporates a lot of material culture, but also some small but flat spaces. There's a lot of stuff there, so I would not suggest that this area where my cursor is a cemetery. I would say it's more likely an area where there was small gardens that incorporated other uses, food, potentially herbs, as opposed to like the terraced gardens, which were most likely for flowers and for sophisticated plants and arrangements. There could be more slave quarters here that were kind of auxiliary and worked within the house setting, the kind of house quarter area. But yeah, I don't think we've been able to ascertain a specific area where it's likely to have a cemetery as yet. But that's, I think, where LiDAR might actually come into play and be helpful, or just continued comprehensive walkovers where you're looking for that consistency of seeing these 6 foot by 2 foot depressions in the ground or slightly smaller, and then finding enough of them to feel like it's worthy of doing a more intensive research. They might also want to reach out to folks at Mount Vernon and maybe Monticello. I know that Mount Vernon has been undertaking an extensive identification survey of their enslaved African cemetery for a long time, like the last 4 to 5 years minimum. And maybe just asking them briefly, like, hey, I know that they probably knew where it was based on documents, but what did it look like before you started excavating? How many of those graves appeared in depressions on the ground versus how many were clear once the excavations were underway? Because they never excavated the human remains. They were just looking for the very tops of the grave shafts so that they could then go back in and mark each of the grave shafts. Theirs is a memorialization. It's not a research expedition in the sense like trying to get people's DNA or trying to go ahead and to connect individual family members with individual human remains sets. That's a different discussion entirely. Mount Vernon's approach, I think, is mostly just to make sure that they understand something about that process of when slaves were burying their dead and how it works within the larger landscape as they engage with their descendant communities.
Okay.
Okay. I think we've kind of run our time.
I just have one more thing to say about that. We have not exhausted all of, there's, as you all know, I like to say we're kind of in the beginning of everything. Even though we've been around as an institution for 25 years, as Dave knows, as a lot of folks know, the preservation effort of this place was due to the Francis Lightfoot Lee connection, the white owner who signed the Declaration of Independence. And really for your first 15 to 20 years, that was the motivating effort. And a lot of the research that went behind this place was with that effort. In the last, I don't know how many years, especially as we've gotten closer, that has changed. And as we've gotten more researchers, we've more people around us here, I'm hoping the fact that archival research paper is going to find some more clues, as Dave said, to give us some more observations of where some of these places might be on the property. And as we start talking with more descendants, more the Thompson family, as we all know, that was with a long history on the site post Civil War. Maybe something. There's always the hope that something turns up in that nature. And of course, we'll continue to do these physical landscape reviews, and we can talk about what that looks like next time as well. But I just want to say that I think, we're not exhausting our effort, let's say like a Monticello or Montpelier, who's had a long history of looking through their archival research for this stuff. We are just beginning to scratch the surface when it comes to that.
Right, that's true. Well, David, I want to thank you for such a wonderful.
Sorry, I'm sorry, Judy. I have one more question. This is Frank. I'm sorry. One more question. David, if you don't mind, or if it would be appropriate, could you maybe, I guess, email Alice maybe 3 or 4 grants or monies that we might pursue to maybe specifically do the top-notch LiDAR search or something like that? Or if you know of anything, if I'm not, being too pushy, but if you would consider doing that, I think that'd be greatly beneficial.
Let me do it real quick. Alice, I think I've already talked with the new development assistant about the AIA, Archaeological Institute for America, or Archaeology thing. They might find that to be interesting. You may also want to look at potentially National Geographic. I know that they have an expeditions grant thing. Sometimes it's about a person, basically funding a scholar. Sometimes it's about kind of broader spectrum things. I know that those grants, the National Geographic grants, were around a while back. We have not actually pursued the National Geographic one, but we have pursued the other archaeology one, and we did not have luck, but you guys might have a better track record on that than I do. So I'd encourage you to pursue it regardless, because it's cool science. And when you have the overlap of cool science and other stuff, that's a good thing. A long time ago, like 10 years ago, we were thinking about a collaborative grant with several different organizations that were all going to go ahead and get good quality LiDAR for us. So it was Fairfield, it was Rosewell, it was Menokin, and there was at least one other place, because we all had significant acreages that we were interested in, and we wanted to tell these kind of larger landscape stories. So I guess the suggestion I'd have is that you definitely want to look at collaborative research grants, NEH, IMLS. I'm not sure how much you guys are going to be on hold for those, since you've gotten such really great track record of getting those, and my applaud to you guys for being able to secure those. But I know that sometimes you have a bunch of different hungry mouths to feed, and the government says, okay, well, if this one candy bar will feed you all, then here's a candy bar. So I think those are the big ones. The small ones are not going to be big enough, because your LiDAR is probably looking at probably 25 grand minimum, because you're going to have to hire a specific place to go ahead and get it. There may be a weird off chance that you've got good LiDAR for your area, but my guess is the best you have is mid-grade, because that's most of your kind of floodplain or flood management committees for your county, and your localities are going to have that information. And so, it's obviously it's a good thing to ask, because those folks sometimes actually have contacts and other folks that can do it. We did reach out previously to a bunch of folks to go ahead and get an estimate for doing LiDAR at Ware-Wacomico. The Park Service was really interested in doing that. And they now have drone-based LiDAR. So you're no longer contracting with somebody who's got a plane and dealing with like jet fuel or things like that. So the odds that it's going to come down in the near future are somewhat good. But those two groups in particular, the National Geographic and AIA, would probably be two I would look at. I'm not sure where it would be more interesting to them than any other group. So, you could be looking at Mary Morton Parsons or Roller Baltimore or Cole, or the usual, as we like to call them. They might be just as intrigued by this, because it's a moment for them to go ahead and see themselves contributing to issues that are beyond just the normal ones, and particularly working with descendant communities. That search, honestly, the data is going to be amazing, and it's going to infuse all of these different research questions that you could have for all of these different groups that you could be engaged with. If you're looking for the Tobacco Road Rollers of America, I don't think they exist, but if they did, they would be like, oh, great. Or, maybe there's a mill nearby, or maybe there's environmental groups that obviously would love to go ahead and have that detail because of what it talks about historical ecology. And if I can think of any other groups, I would be happy to make sure I shared that information. We have like 6 or 7 other funding priorities, so I'd be happy to pass it along and probably not even compete with you guys. But yeah, if you do decide to do something collaborative, let us know. Every once in a while we get lucky and we're looking to team up. So yeah, we may know a couple of other folks we could drag into the party.
Okay, thanks so much, David. This has to be the beginning of an ongoing connection that we'll have. And so I'll look forward to the next time we get together. But I think it's time for us to adjourn this meeting, and I'll see you again in October, the
Thank
4th
you all.
Tuesday in October. Thanks to everybody for time, and I think this was pretty productive today.
Yeah. Thank you all. It's good to see everybody.
Be
All
well.
right,
Bye-bye.
everybody have a good day.
You do the same.
Alice, Judy, you behave up there in New Jersey now. Don't get no trouble.
I'll try. I'll try. Okay.
Bye.
Talk to everybody
Bye.
soon.
All right.
Be well.
Take
Okay.
care.